Okay, this is The Renaissance Began with a Muted Shade of Green from the collection of short stories, The Renaissance Began with a Muted Shade of Green by Susan Scutti. And it was published by Linear Arts, which is Vic Sorrow and Jesse Weiner. Hues of green shaded Kevin's dreams. In the first episode, he reached for a dangling tube which he grasped lost. He made a second attempt, but this time his outstretched hand changed color nightmarishly to lime. Another dream, actually a mere black and white fragment, he boarded a subway train, and mid-ride the clothes of the other occupants in the car suddenly shifted from a shadowed gray to a moss green. Finally, he dreamed he was making love to her, and just as his hand gently parted legs, their fleshy tone altered suddenly to verdigris. After this dream, he began to paint again, using only the color verdigris. They were playful bursts on the canvas, inchoate shaped by gesture. Oddly enough, they were reminiscent of O'Keeffe times, and at others Pollock. He decided all of them would share one title, The Crack in My Conscious Mind, and he'd differentiate them by placing a number after each. When he'd completed 5 paintings, Steve, his closest neighbor in the building and most frequent visitor, spent a longer time than usual watching Kevin work. He made no comments as Kevin continued to paint his small 2x4 feet canvases, undisturbed by the stare fixed on him. "What are you calling that color?" Steve asked. "Verdigris," said Kevin. "How did you get started on this monochromatic kick?" "I did," Kevin said. "I'll paint it as long as it lasts." "Sounds healthy." Steve continued to watch Kevin, who had not been painting for months, who had, in fact, been exclusively drinking for the past 9 months or so, ever since Michelle failed him, or so Steve described it. Married to another man, Michelle seduced Kevin, used him to help her abandon her husband, then abandon him in turn. How deeply Kevin had been hurt by her, by the early warnings of Steve. Kevin's a big man, essentially expressive in every way, though most of all through his paintings. He appeared to be the proverbial strong and type. Most women automatically presumed he composed canvas instead of using words, but he was articulate, exceedingly so. In fact, few women could comprehend this duality, this true inner complexity, which was more than fortunate because Kevin was a man who very much needed women, more than men. Add to this the fact that Kevin's emotional quality came in huge dimensions, his generosity, his dignity, his capacity to love, and he was left too much alone by who had no place in their lives for a character of Tolstoy proportions. "I don't think of it as chromatic," Kevin said suddenly, apropos of nothing. He held a knife, and under Steve's watchful eye he carefully put the core of paint at the center of the canvas. "I think of it as enough." Steve said, "You know what kind of reaction you're going to get. You don't need me to tell you that. I just don't want to hear you when they come back at you with all the usual garbage they say." "I can deal with it," Kevin said. "You say that, but in a month you'll be drunk and shouting at strangers and getting your ass kicked every bar from here to Chelsea." Steve studied, who once again was completely absorbed by the work of painting, just color to engulf all, to isolate himself with a single hue. "For the first time in a while you're doing good work again." Kevin didn't seem to hear. He continued to paint. There is a neighborhood in Manhattan where most of the restaurants are identified by painted, not neon, signs. Dogs walk on leashes long enough to give a sense of freedom to both animal and man. Quiet is preserved there by an appearance of abandonment, yet creaking elevators rise to furnished lofts at almost every hour, and neighbors greet each other by name. In this neighborhood, on the 3rd floor of a building stands beside a slim alley, Kevin lives and paints. After he finished The Crack in My Conscious Mind, number 6, Kevin dreamed of his hometown. The dream lurched through history and place, progressing to a party scene loft, but it was not his loft, it was the main rotunda of one of the university buildings he'd walked through daily on the way to his grad school. The woman he'd slept with since Michelle was standing there alone. She lifted her hand, waved to him, and then she turned to the door behind her. The dream ended there. He woke. A car alarm wailed from far off, and the muffled shout of Steve's insomniac footsteps passed overhead. Kevin's union with this woman had been sweet-natured. He took her cautiously beneath the single white comforter, then effortlessly poured himself inside her. She was the one woman he'd slept with Michelle because all of his other opportunities, women his friends had slept with, women he'd met in galleries and bars, didn't reach some little part of him, the piece of him that could respond to the empty need for comfort. She was someone who struck him as himself, a woman of similar, though feminine, proportions. Someone who would not violate him, someone who would not take from him. As they walked from the bar to his loft, he had told her about his time with Michelle. All she did take from me. I let her in my life, and like a rat, she ate all my cheese. He had smiled when he told her this story. He wanted to make her see that he wouldn't let that happen again. He wouldn't let another woman take from him in that way. He threw with takers. He wanted only givers. And he could see this in her, yet he wanted to deny it. She was the first non-destructive thing he had reached for since he'd begun to drink months and months ago. She wouldn't stop talking, yet she warmed him. Eventually he hurt her with his tongue as well, silencing her, giving her all of himself at once, giving her what he knew she needed. Beneath him, her face looked mute, like a portrait by Botticelli. Afterwards, he didn't make any efforts to get in with her. She called him a few times, even showed up at the liquor store, dressed and with a supportive friend. Both she and the girlfriend stared at him with all the inevitable hunger felt by the rejected. Still, he didn't want to get involved because he preferred his grief for Michelle. Even more, he sensed his single night with the woman was somehow sufficient. In what sense, he was not completely sure, but sufficient somehow for each of them. After his second dream, where she appeared and disappeared, he entered a second phase in his work. He composed now muted shades of red and blue. He layered these two colors over a resonant enamel white, and in odd crevice-like shapes left some of this whiteness, so much innocence, exposed. He titled this new series, Through an Open Door She Walked. Again, he placed a separate number after each title. You're mixing oil and acrylic? Steve watched Kevin's hands as he squeezed paint from a tube into a small can. You're back to a full palette. Steve studied the canvas, spoke his thoughts. Not quite, just red and blue. Kevin shrugged. I'm going to paint your portrait next, in purple. Oils only. You wish you could paint my portrait. Behind his head, Steve's graying ponytail wagged like a schoolteacher's finger. I don't have the skill. Kevin said, you have the face. There are too many pretty faces, said Steve. It takes a real man to make an ugly one. Meditatively, Steve chewed his sandwich, peanut butter and banana on rye. What would be the English equivalent of face in Japanese? Cover your ass? A taut line of a smile replaced a concentrated expression on Kevin's face. I think that's about right. Steve said, we agree on something. The red and blue hues in Kevin's canvas escalated in power. The bright colors rose to the top, the darkest fell to the bottom. The general emotion of the work, though, was circular. He spent long, still hours simply staring at the canvas. From a completely stationary position, he would suddenly move, brush in hand, mark the canvas. His entire process seemed related to that of an athlete who crouches in a ready position, then springs in the contest. This was new for him. He still drank excessively, but was content to do so in private. He no longer needed the public arena of a bar, complete with rebels and insult-worthy suits, in order to gain social perspective, liberation, which drinking had always brought. He was a well-managed alcoholic now, and dutifully his friends circulated rumors through the art world that he had reformed. His true friends were not blind to his addiction. They simply did not see it as a central figure in his emotional landscape. His larger qualities meant more to those who loved him than his lesser ones. A successful man, especially one who shows the signs of even greater achievement, has few true friends. He'd gained a small but solid reputation in the 80s art world, then abruptly lost that reputation in the 90s. He had become tired of the endless charade of gallery exhibitions. For the past few years he had only to produce museum-quality art, lasting work. He was tired of the immediate politics of marketing and sales. He didn't want to sell himself to gallery owners and buyers anymore. He was sick of that, the politics. He no longer wanted reputation, he just wanted to paint. How great is the pain of not receiving when you deserve. Destructive is the grief of losing the one person you love. How much suffering can one person endure? Months ago, when Kevin first discovered the fact that Michelle had lied to him, when he recognized exactly what it was, he felt as if his inner emotional ground had been hit by a tornado. Daily, waves of feeling drenched him, humiliation, remorse, even love. The pain of this storm was greater than any other he experienced. Each day a fresh emotional charge incapacitated him. He stopped working. He started drinking. Only when he had become exhausted by emotion did he even want to paint again. Tired of feeling, he concentrated on his palette instead. Oddly self-conscious his own progression, painting first with verdigris alone, then in muted blues and reds, and finally with a full palette. Suddenly he recognized the correspondence of emotion and color. He finally saw that 5 essential feelings, passion, apathy, need, fear, hope existed. All other emotional experiences, remorse, humiliation, even love, arose simply from combinations of two or more primary feelings. Rich, vivid life from so little. Kevin stood and stretched towards the March sunlight filtering through his dusty windows. Looking down into the street, Kevin noticed the neat form of a shadow following a small woman. Below Kevin's window, the small woman brushed the hair from her eyes while crossing the street, and he was suddenly reminded of the woman in his dreams. Thinking back on the one night he'd spent with her, Kevin remembered waking and seeing that she had turned from him in sleep. Facing the windows, her face shone with light streaming through the glass, and her blonde hair appeared cloud behind her. In this light he could see her paleness, her delicate structure. When she finally shifted in her sleep and looked up at him, he felt suddenly surprised because in night's darkness he thought her eyes were brown. It was only in daylight he saw their true color, verdigris. Now Kevin could understand that he'd slept with her and not any other woman for the most complex reason of all. He had sensed that she would absorb his pain. And it was true, he felt lighter now. Now Kevin felt as if suffering were something that happened to people. In this way, Kevin's downward spiral was shifted upward once again by a moment of blind grasping, an instant of instinctive trust. And so Renaissance followed the darkest age of his soul. Thanks.